Bernard Otis paused mid-swipe of his mop as Chelsea Meyers, billionaire CEO of Meyers Global Holdings, waved a printed riddle before her executive team like a game show host dangling $1 million prize. "Get this right and you'll never clean again," she announced, her voice dripping with amusement. 50,000 dirham, my daily salary to whoever cracks this investor's puzzle. The glass-walled boardroom erupted in nervous laughter as executives in tailored suits exchanged panicked glances. Bernard kept his eyes on the marble floor, tracing slow circles with his mop while the words projected on the screen burned into his vision. "I am born of truth but feared by power. I hide in numbers, yet reveal what's real. What am I?" "Maybe we should hire a consultant," Derek Morrison, VP of Strategy, joked, his Princeton ring tapping against the conference table. "Probably cheaper than admitting none of us can solve a basic riddle." More laughter. Chelsea's designer heel clicked against Bernard's bucket as she stepped past him, barely registering his presence. Bernard's pulse quickened. His late father's voice echoed in his memory. "Truth hides best in plain sight, son." The riddle wasn't just familiar. It was identical to the cipher Samuel Otis had scribbled in his notebooks 15 years ago, weeks before his mysterious death. The same notebooks that detailed fraud within this very company. The same investigation that had been buried alongside his father's reputation. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a notification from the hospital billing department. $28,000 overdue. His mother's care facility threatening discharge. The eviction notice taped to his apartment door gave him 14 days. Bernard's fingers brushed the worn leather journal hidden in his work vest. His father's final gift, filled with riddles and encrypted warnings about Project Helios. The numbers embedded in that puzzle weren't decoration. They were coordinates to the truth his father had died protecting. Would revealing what he knew to those who looked through him bring justice, or simply make him the next casualty? The question hung in the air like smoke as Bernard quietly rolled his cart toward the door. Invisible once more. Bernard hadn't always been invisible. 20 years ago, he was the bright-eyed boy who solved Sunday crosswords faster than his father could fill. In The First Clue. Back then, Samuel Otis would ruffle his son's hair and say, "You've got your mother's patience and my stubbornness. That's either going to make you brilliant or broke." Turned out it could make you both. Bernard's apartment smelled like instant coffee and overdue regret. The fluorescent kitchen light flickered as he unlocked the door at 11:47 p.m., his janitorial uniform still damp with the scent of industrial cleaner and humiliation. He dropped his keys on the counter beside the eviction notice. Bold red letters screaming, "Final warning, 14 days." And next to it, a stack of unopened envelopes from St. Catherine's Extended Care Facility. He didn't need to open them to know what they said. His mother's treatment was $2,100 per week. He made $480. The math had stopped adding up 6 months ago. Bernard crossed the cramped living room, stepping over a cracked floorboard that groaned like a confession, and knelt before the wooden trunk at the foot of his futon. The leather was cracked and faded, its brass hinges green with age. He hadn't opened it in 3 years, not since the anniversary of his father's death, when the weight of remembering had nearly crushed him. Tonight was different. Tonight the past had walked back into his life, wearing Chelsea Meyers' smile and carrying his father's riddle. He lifted the lid. The smell hit him first. Old paper, sandalwood ink, and something deeper. Grief, maybe, or unfinished business. Inside lay Samuel Otis's journals, 5 leather-bound notebooks filled with elegant handwriting, cryptic symbols, and the kind of questions that made powerful people nervous. Bernard pulled out the 3rd journal, his fingers trembling as he flipped past entries dated 15 years ago. Pages of financial analysis. Margin notes in red ink. Highlighted names, Richard Miles, Chelsea Meyers, Project Helios. And then, halfway through, he found it. The riddle. "I am born of truth, but feared by power. I hide in numbers, yet reveal what's real. What am I?" Beneath it, in his father's precise script, fail-safe cipher, use only if internal channels compromised, coordinates embedded in numeric sequence, H732194. Archive server, basement level. Project Helios documentation. Truth is the key. Truth is always the key. Bernard's breath caught. His father's handwriting blurred as memories crashed over him. Fragmented scenes he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. Samuel Otis had been Myers Global's golden boy once. Senior financial analyst, 15 years of service, 2 commendations for excellence. The man who'd helped build the company's international portfolio from the ground up, forging partnerships across Asia and South America that turned Myers Global from a mid-sized firm into a billion-dollar empire. Bernard remembered his father coming home in tailored suits, carrying Bernard on his shoulders through their old neighborhood, promising that hard work and integrity would always win in the end. "The numbers don't lie, son," Samuel would say, hunched over spreadsheets at the kitchen table long after Bernard should have been asleep. "People do, institutions do, but if you follow the numbers, you'll always find the truth." Then came the discrepancies. Bernard had been 13 when his father first mentioned Project Helios, a humanitarian initiative supposedly funneling $50 million into educational infrastructure in Southeast Asia. Samuel was assigned to audit the fund's allocation. Routine compliance check. Should have taken 2 weeks. It took him 6 months to realize the money had never left the United States. Bernard remembered the change in his father, the way Samuel started locking his office door, the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when Bernard entered the room. The nights his mother, Grace, would sit at the kitchen table with her hands folded, staring at nothing, while his father paced the living room with journals spread across every surface. "They're stealing from children, Grace," Bernard had overheard one night, pressed against his bedroom wall. "Falsifying reports, diverting funds through shell accounts. I've traced $32 million to a Cayman holding company, one that didn't exist before Chelsea Meyers joined the board." "Then report it," his mother had whispered. "Go to the authorities." "I tried. Internal compliance shut me down. HR said I was misinterpreting standard restructuring procedures." "They're protecting her, Grace. They're all protecting her." 3 weeks later, Samuel Otis reported his findings to the SEC anyway. 5 days after that, he was dead. The official report called it a car accident, brake failure on a rainy Wednesday morning. Samuel's sedan had veered off Route 9, crashed through a guardrail, and plunged into the Mercer River. No witnesses, no surveillance footage. The police investigation closed within 48 hours. Mechanical failure, driver error, tragic coincidence. Bernard had been at school when it happened. He remembered the principal calling him to the office, his mother's tear-streaked face, the way the world had tilted and never quite righted itself again. At the funeral, Richard Miles himself had attended, founder and former CEO of Myers Global. Silver-haired and somber, in an Italian suit, he'd shaken Bernard's hand and said, "Your father was a good man. This company owes him a great debt." 2 months later, the life insurance claim was denied. Pre-existing heart condition, they said, though Samuel had never missed a day of work for illness. The severance package that should have sustained them vanished into legal fees and medical debt from the accident investigation Bernard's mother had demanded. Grace Otis had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Bernard had dropped out of community college to help. They'd moved from their suburban home to a 1-bedroom apartment in the city, and Samuel's journals, his final act of rebellion, had been locked in a trunk and buried under years of survival. Until tonight. Bernard turned the page, his heart hammering against his ribs. More entries, more numbers, and then, at the bottom of the final page, a list of names. Richard Miles, founder, deceased 2019. Chelsea Meyers, protege, current CEO. Victor Lawrence, CFO, relocated 2011. Dr. Lionel Grange, external investor, mathematician. Bernard froze. Dr. Lionel Grange, the investor who'd sent the riddle to Myers Global today. The man whose puzzle had stopped Chelsea's executives in their tracks. His father had known him. Bernard flipped back through the journal, searching for context, and found a margin note dated 3 weeks before Samuel's death. LG agrees. If internal exposure fails, external pressure required. Riddle will serve as authentication. Only someone with access to my work will recognize the pattern. Insurance policy in case I don't survive this. The room tilted. Bernard gripped the edge of the trunk, his vision swimming. His father had planned for this, had known he might die, and he'd left a trail, not for investigators or journalists, but for someone who would understand. Someone who'd been raised on riddles and ciphers and the belief that truth mattered more than comfort. He'd left it for Bernard. The riddle wasn't a test of intelligence. It was a beacon, a signal flare sent 15 years into the future, waiting for the right person to see it. And Dr. Lionel Grange, whoever he was, had just reactivated his father's failsafe. Bernard's phone buzzed. A text from his mother's facility. "Mr. Otis, this is your final courtesy notice. Payment must be received by Monday, October 20th, or we will be forced to begin discharge proceedings. We understand this is difficult. Please contact our billing department to discuss options." Bernard looked at the eviction notice, at the hospital bills, at his father's journal, open to a page that promised coordinates to the truth his father had died protecting. The number stared back at him, H732194. A location, a flyer, a weapon. He thought of Chelsea Meyers laughing in her glass tower, waving $50 and $100 like it was pocket change, while his mother wasted away in a care facility he couldn't afford. He thought of the executives who'd mocked him, never knowing the man emptying their trash cans carried his father's legacy in his chest like shrapnel. And he thought of the riddle, his father's last gift, disguised as a corporate game. I am born of truth, but feared by power. I hide in numbers, yet reveal what's real. What am I? The answer wasn't just a word, it was a choice. Bernard closed the journal and pressed it against his forehead, his father's voice echoing across 15 years of silence. The numbers don't lie, son. Follow them, and you'll find the truth. Outside, the city hummed with indifferent life, sirens and laughter in the distant rumble of the late-night train. Inside, Bernard Otis sat in the ruins of his invisible life and made a decision that would either redeem his father's name or bury them both. He would solve the riddle. He would find Project Helios. And he would make Chelsea Meyers remember the name Samuel Otis, even if it cost him everything, because some debts could only be paid in truth. The executive floor was never truly empty. Bernard had learned this during his first week at Myers Global, that the glass towers of power hummed with secrets long after the daylight staff clocked out. Deals were sealed at midnight. Crises were managed in whispered conference calls. And the people who thought they ruled the world rarely noticed the man emptying their trash cans. Tonight, he wasn't just cleaning. He was hunting. Bernard pushed his cart past the executive lounge at 9:47 p.m., the fluorescent lights casting his shadow long and thin across the marble floor. Through the half-open door of conference room B, voices leaked into the hallway. Urgent, strained, afraid. Merger falls through if we don't solve this ridiculous puzzle by Monday. Derek Morrison's voice, stripped of its usual arrogance. Grange won't even take our calls anymore. He just keeps sending that same damn riddle. Then solve it, Chelsea Meyers snapped. Bernard slowed his cart, feigning interest in a scuff mark on the wall. I'm paying you 6 figures to think. Start earning it. With all due respect, this isn't a business problem. It's a cryptography problem. Maybe we should outsource to who? A consulting firm? So they can bill us $50,000 to tell us what Google couldn't? Chelsea's laugh was sharp as broken glass. At this point, we might as well ask the janitors. At least they'd work for minimum wage. Bernard's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes down, kept moving, kept playing invisible. The door slammed. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, Chelsea's heels striking marble like a judge's gavel. She swept past Bernard without a glance, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and barely concealed panic. He waited until the elevator doors closed. Then he slipped into conference room B. The printout lay abandoned on the table, crumpled and coffee-stained, a casualty of executive frustration. Bernard locked the door behind him and approached it like a relic in a museum, carefully, reverently, aware that some objects carried weight beyond their physical form. He smoothed the paper under the overhead light. The riddle stared back at him in clean serif font. I am born of truth, but feared by power. I hide in numbers, yet reveal what's real. What am I? But Bernard wasn't looking at the words anymore. He was looking through them. He tilted the page, letting the fluorescent light hit it at an angle. There, faint impressions pressed into the paper's fiber, barely visible unless you knew to search. Numbers indented as if someone had written on a page stacked above this one, the pressure leaving ghost imprints. H732194. His father's coordinates, the same sequence from the journal, a location hiding in plain sight, waiting 15 years for someone to see it. Bernard pulled out his phone and photographed the indentations, his hands trembling. Then he folded the printout, tucked it into his vest pocket, and unlocked the maintenance closet at the end of the hall. The terminal inside was ancient, a dusty desktop that predated the company's sleek, modern infrastructure. Most employees didn't know it existed. Bernard had discovered it during his second month, when he'd been tasked with cleaning the storage sublevel. The login credentials were taped to the underside of the keyboard. Main user, global access, MI94. Security through obscurity. The kind of vulnerability his father would have documented and reported. The kind that got ignored until it became useful. Bernard logged in, the interface loaded, a relic of Windows XP, all blue backgrounds and pixelated icons. He navigated to the archived file server, typing deliberately. The screen flickered. Then the directory opened. Folders upon folders, spreadsheets with names, PDF scans of forged bank statements, encrypted communications between Richard Miles and offshore account managers. Bernard's breath came shallow and fast. He clicked on a file labeled Project Helios Summary. Down, the document loaded, a 50-page audit report dated March 2010, authored by Samuel Otis. On the first page, highlighted in yellow, Executive Summary. Project Helios, ostensibly a $50 million humanitarian fund for educational infrastructure in Southeast Asia, has been systematically defrauded. Analysis of transfer records reveals 32 million diverted through shell company, Meridian Holdings, Cayman Islands, registered under signatory Chelsea Meyers, then junior board member. Falsified donation receipts supplied to investors. Recommend immediate external audit and criminal investigation. Bernard's vision blurred. His mop bucket sat beside him, its dirty water reflecting his pale, ghost-like face in the dim light. This wasn't ancient history. This wasn't a cautionary tale about corporate greed. This was the crime that had killed his father. And Chelsea Meyers, who'd laughed at him, who'd kicked his card aside, who'd joked about janitors being too stupid to matter, had built her empire on the money stolen from children who'd never received the schools they'd been promised. Bernard's phone buzzed. Another text from the care facility. Final reminder. Payment due Monday. He stared at the screen, then at the documents glowing before him. The coordinates his father had hidden. The evidence Dr. Lionel Grange's riddle had been designed to unearth. The truth that had been buried for 15 years under corporate lawyers and convenient accidents. His father's voice echoed in his memory. The numbers don't lie, son. No, they didn't. Bernard downloaded the files onto a USB drive hidden in his boot. Then he cleared the browser history, logged out, and stood in the dim closet, staring at his reflection in the black monitor screen. A janitor, invisible, powerless, or a man carrying a bomb made of truth, waiting to decide where it would detonate. Chelsea Meyers had built her empire on the ability to read rooms and control narratives. This morning, the room was unraveling, and the narrative had turned against her. Someone tell me, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut marble, why 12 executives with combined salaries exceeding $4 million annually cannot solve a riddle a child could answer. Silence. Derek Morrison studied his laptop screen as if it contained salvation. Amanda Chen, VP of International Relations, adjusted her glasses repeatedly, a nervous tick Chelsea had learned to read as panic. The investor meeting is Monday, Chelsea continued, pacing before the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Dr. Grange has made his terms explicit. Solve the riddle or the merger collapses. That's $1.2 billion walking out the door because none of you can. It's not a standard puzzle, Derek interrupted weakly. It's coded. There's subtext we're missing. Then find the subtext. Chelsea slammed the printout on the table. The riddle stared up at them, mocking in its simplicity. I am born of truth, but feared by power. I hide in numbers, yet reveal what's real. What am I? At this rate, Chelsea said, her tone dripping with contempt, maybe we should ask the janitor. At least he'd have an excuse for failing. Laughter rippled through the room, nervous, performative, desperate to diffuse tension. Chelsea allowed herself a thin smile. Control restored, if only momentarily. Then the door opened. Bernard Otis entered with his cleaning cart, the wheels squeaking softly against polished marble. Heads turned, then dismissed him. He was furniture, background, the invisible labor that kept their towers gleaming. Perfect timing, Chelsea said, gesturing theatrically. Bernard, isn't it? Tell me, can you solve riddles? More laughter, Derek's face colored with secondhand embarrassment. Bernard paused, his hand steady on the cart's handle. I can try, he said quietly. The laughter died. Chelsea's smile flickered, amusement laced with surprise. She hadn't expected a response, let alone one delivered without defensiveness or humor. By all means, she slid the paper across the table toward him. Enlighten us. Bernard approached slowly, methodically, as if crossing an invisible threshold he couldn't uncross. He picked up the printout, studying it under the boardroom's harsh lighting. 12 executives watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright contempt. He flipped the page over, tilted it, held it up to the light. Then he murmured, barely audible, 7, 3, 2, 1, 9, 4. Chelsea's smile froze. What did you say? Bernard looked up, his dark eyes steady and unreadable. The indentations in the paper fiber. Someone wrote coordinates above this sheet, the pressure left marks. He pointed to the faint impressions. H732194. It's a file location. The room went silent, not the uncomfortable silence of before, but something heavier, denser, a silence built from the sudden recognition that assumptions had just collapsed. Derek leaned forward, squinting at the paper. I don't see anything. You're not looking correctly, Bernard said softly. He handed the paper back to Chelsea, whose fingers closed around it like a trap. The riddle isn't just words. It's a map. Chelsea stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she forced a laugh, brittle, performative. Well, how resourceful. Thank you, Bernard. That'll be all. Dismissal, clear and final. Bernard nodded once and returned to his cart. As he pushed it toward the door, he felt their eyes on his back. 12 gazes, recalibrating, reassessing, uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. The door closed behind him. He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling against the cart's handle. Inside the boardroom, Chelsea stared at the paper, her mind racing. The coordinates meant nothing to her, but the unease coiling in her stomach suggested they should. The tower was silent except for the hum of climate control and the distant wail of sirens 40 floors below. Chelsea sat at her desk, a tumbler of scotch untouched beside her laptop, scrolling through archived files she hadn't opened in 15 years. Project Helios. The name surfaced in a subdirectory labeled Archives Less Defunct 2010, buried under layers of corporate restructuring and deliberate obfuscation. She clicked it open, financial reports, transfer records, and there, in the metadata, authored by Samuel Otis, senior financial analyst. Chelsea's jaw tightened. Samuel Otis, the whistleblower, the man who tried to destroy everything Richard Miles had built, everything she'd inherited, the man whose accusations had been discredited, whose death had been ruled an accident, whose name was supposed to have been erased, and now his coordinates were embedded in an investor's riddle, decoded by a janitor who shared his last name. Chelsea's hand hovered over the keyboard. Then, with deliberate precision, she selected the entire Helios directory and pressed delete. The confirmation dialog appeared. Are you sure? She clicked yes. The files vanished. Chelsea closed the laptop and drained her scotch, the liquid burning her throat like absolution. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Bernard Otis had already copied every file to a USB drive hidden in his boot, that the evidence she'd just destroyed existed in duplicate, carried home by the man she'd dismissed as invisible, that the janitor she'd mocked was holding her empire in the palm of his calloused hand. The basement of Myers Global Holdings smelled like forgotten history, mold, old paper, and the metallic tang of deteriorating electronics. Bernard sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, his laptop balanced on a stack of discarded file boxes, the screen's blue glow illuminating his exhausted face. The USB drive contained everything. Every transaction, every falsified report, every lie his father had died trying to expose. Bernard scrolled through the master ledger, his eyes burning from hours of decryption. The numbers told a story more damning than any testimony. Project Helios, Fund Allocation Summary, 2009-2010. Authorized budget, 50,000. Educational infrastructure, Southeast Asia. Actual disbursement to intended recipients, $18,000. Diverted funds at the $32,000. Primary destination, Meridian Holdings, LLC, Cayman Islands. Registered signatory, Chelsea A. Meyers, Junior Board Member, Myers Global. Secondary beneficiaries, Richard Miles, Founder, CEO, Victor Lawrence, CFO. The fraud was elegant in its simplicity. Humanitarian funds donated by investors, corporations, and government grants, money meant for schools, libraries, and teacher training programs, had been siphoned through shell companies and deposited into offshore accounts that financed Chelsea's meteoric rise from junior board member to CEO. Children who should have received education received nothing, and Chelsea Meyers built her empire in their stolen futures. Bernard's father's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if Samuel were sitting beside him in the dusty basement. Truth hides best in plain sight, son. They bury it in numbers, hoping no one will dig deep enough to see. Well, Bernard had dug, and what he'd found would either redeem his father's name or bury them both. He selected the most damning page, the transfer authorization signed by Chelsea herself, dated March 17, 2010, and hit print. The ancient laser printer in the corner wheezed to life, its mechanical grinding loud as thunder in the silent basement. The paper emerged warm in his hands. Evidence, proof, justice distilled into black ink on white paper. Bernard folded it carefully and tucked it into his vest pocket, next to his father's journal. The weight of it felt like carrying a grenade with the pin already pulled. Bernard made copies, 3 prints, each one an insurance policy against erasure. He folded 2 into his boot, beneath the insole where the USB drive already rested. The third he held, staring at Chelsea's signature, confident, sweeping, unaware it would one day become her confession. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Bernard's pulse spiked. He shoved the printout into his jacket and killed the printer just as the break room door swung open. 2 security guards filled the doorway, their expressions professionally neutral. Behind them, visible through the glass partition, stood Derek Morrison with his phone pressed to his ear. "Bernard Otis?" the first guard asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes. We need you to come with us. There's been a report of unauthorized computer access." The guard's hand rested casually on his belt, near the radio. "Ms. Myers has ordered a full security sweep." Bernard's mind raced. The laptop was closed, the USB drive hidden, but the printer was still warm, and the recycling bin beside it held discarded test prints, fragments of the evidence he'd just unearthed. "Of course," Bernard said calmly. "I was just finishing my rounds." They escorted him through the building, 1 guard ahead, 1 behind. A prisoner's march disguised as procedure. Employees who worked night shifts paused to watch, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. As they passed the executive lounge, Bernard glimpsed Chelsea through the glass, standing at her window overlooking the city, a phone pressed to her ear, her posture rigid with controlled fury. She'd realized someone had accessed Project Helios. She'd ordered the purge. And now she was making sure the janitor who'd decoded her investor's riddle would never decode anything else. They walked him out through the service entrance, the same door he'd entered every night for 3 years. The guard handed him a manila envelope. "Your personal effects, employee badge, locker contents. Your employment with Myers Global Holdings is terminated effective immediately for violation of security protocols. You'll receive your final paycheck via direct deposit." Bernard took the envelope. Inside, his ID badge, a pen that didn't work, and the crumpled photo of his mother he kept in his locker. "Understood," he said quietly. The guards waited until he'd walked to the parking lot's edge before returning inside. Bernard stood in the pre-dawn darkness, the city's ambient glow painting everything the color of old bruises. He was fired, escorted out like a criminal, exactly as his father had been 15 years ago. But Bernard wasn't his father. He'd learned from Samuel's mistakes. He'd planned for this. As he walked toward the bus stop, he passed the building's recycling station, industrial bins where office waste was collected before being processed. Bernard paused, glancing back at the security cameras. Then, with a single fluid motion, he dropped the third printout into the blue recycling bin marked paper only. It fluttered down among discarded memos, coffee-stained reports, and yesterday's forgotten documents. Invisible, unnoticed, a single sheet of truth hiding in plain sight, exactly as his father had taught him. Chelsea could delete files. She could fire janitors. She could erase digital trails and silence whistleblowers. But she couldn't search every recycling bin in a 40-story building. And when the right person found that paper, a maintenance worker, a custodian, someone else society had trained to be invisible, it would surface again. Bernard smiled grimly as the first bus of the morning arrived. He'd lost his job, but he still carried the evidence in his boot, the truth in his hands, and his father's legacy burning in his chest. The long game had just begun. Chelsea Meyers entered the boardroom expecting control. What she found was chaos wrapped in corporate politeness. The riddle glowed on the projection screen, larger than before, impossible to ignore. But this time, it arrived with a subject line that made her blood run cold. Final chance for truth. Executives clustered in tight groups, whispering like students before an exam they hadn't studied for. Derek Morrison stood by the windows, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression grim. Amanda Chen held a printed email, her hands trembling visibly. "Someone explain," Chelsea said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "why we're looking at Friday's riddle on Monday morning." Derek turned, his face ashen. It came directly from Dr. Lionel Grange, 30 minutes ago. He's demanding a video call at 9:30 to discuss integrity verification before finalizing the merger. Chelsea's stomach dropped. Dr. Lionel Grange, the reclusive billionaire mathematician whose $1.2 billion investment could either save Myers Global or destroy it. The man who'd sent the original riddle, the man whose background check had revealed nothing except genius and an obsessive commitment to ethical business practices. "Then we give him an answer," Chelsea said, forcing confidence into her voice. "We've had 3 days. We haven't solved it," Amanda interrupted quietly. "And he knows we haven't. The email says he's disappointed but not surprised by our silence." Chelsea gripped the back of her chair, knuckles white. She'd deleted Project Helios. She'd fired the janitor who'd decoded the coordinates. She'd scrubbed every trace of her past from the company's servers. But the riddle remained, and somehow Dr. Grange knew they'd failed his test. The video screen flickered to life. Dr. Lionel Grange appeared, a man in his 70s with steel gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they observed. He sat in what looked like a library, leather-bound books stacked behind him like silent witnesses. "Ms. Myers," he said, his voice gentle but unyielding, "thank you for accepting my call." "Dr. Grange," Chelsea forced a smile, "we're honored to discuss the merger terms." "This isn't about terms." His interruption was surgical, precise. "This is about integrity. 15 years ago, a colleague of mine, Samuel Otis, attempted to expose fraud within your organization. He was silenced. His findings were buried. His family was destroyed." The room went silent. Chelsea felt 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "I sent you a riddle," DeGrange continued, "not as a puzzle, but as a test. The answer was never meant to be clever. It was meant to be honest. Truth is what I was searching for. Truth in your operations. Truth in your leadership. Truth in whether Myers Global has evolved beyond the corruption that built its foundation." Chelsea's throat tightened. "Dr. Grange, I assure you our company maintains the highest ethical standards." "Do you?" His gaze was unwavering. "Because my sources tell me you deleted archived files related to Project Helios within hours of my riddle arriving. You terminated an employee who accessed those same files. And you've spent the weekend covering tracks rather than confronting truth." Derek shifted uncomfortably. Amanda stared at her laptop. The executives who'd laughed at Bernard now looked anywhere but at Chelsea. I want, Dr. Grange said slowly, to hear from the janitor who decoded my coordinates. Bernard Otis. Samuel's son. Chelsea's world tilted. He's no longer employed here. Then bring him back. It wasn't a request. I understand he's waiting in your lobby. Your security chief was kind enough to summon him at my instruction. Let him speak. Let him answer the riddle you couldn't. And let him tell me whether Myers Global deserves the investment I'm considering. The door opened. Two security guards entered, and between them stood Bernard Otis, still in his janitorial uniform, still carrying his father's quiet dignity, still invisible to everyone except the one man whose opinion mattered most. Chelsea's carefully constructed empire cracked down the center. The janitor she'd mocked, the employee she'd fired, the son of the whistleblower she'd helped silence. He stood at the edge of the boardroom, no longer part of the background, but suddenly terrifyingly central to everything. Mr. Otis, Dr. Grange said warmly, thank you for coming. I believe you understand my riddle better than anyone in that room. Bernard met Chelsea's eyes across the polished conference table. No anger, no triumph, just the steady gaze of a man who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. Yes, sir, Bernard said quietly. I do. And in that instant, Chelsea understood. She hadn't been tested by the riddle. She'd been weighed, measured, and found wanting. The janitor had passed, the CEO had failed, the spotlight had shifted, and Bernard Otis stepped from shadow into light, carrying truth in his hands and his father's legacy burning in his chest. The boardroom held its breath. Bernard stood at the edge of the conference table, no longer invisible, no longer part of the background. Every executive who'd laughed at him now watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to dread. Chelsea gripped the armrests of her chair like a woman bracing for collision. Dr. Grange's voice came through the speakers, gentle but unyielding. Mr. Otis, please tell us, what is the answer to my riddle? Bernard's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, calm, precise, unshakable. The answer is truth, he said. It's what built this company and what buried it. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, the printout, the ledger. His father's final gift, carried across 15 years of silence. Bernard unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and laid it before Chelsea Meyers. The paper landed with the weight of a guillotine blade. Numbers, signatures, timestamps. Account transfers from Meridian Holdings, Cayman Islands. Chelsea's name in elegant script at the bottom. Authorized signatory, March 17, 2010. Chelsea stared at it, her face draining of color. Derek Morrison leaned forward, squinting at the document. Amanda Chen's hand flew to her mouth. On the video screen, Dr. Grange leaned closer, his expression unreadable. So Project Helios wasn't a myth after all. No, sir, Bernard said quietly. It was real. The $82 million diverted from humanitarian funds meant for schools in Southeast Asia, funneled through shell companies, used to finance executive bonuses and career advancement. He paused, his eyes never leaving Chelsea. My father documented everything. This is his work. Chelsea's jaw tightened. She forced herself to sit straighter, to reclaim the authority slipping through her fingers. This is stolen data, she said, her voice sharp. Obtained through unauthorized access. Bernard interrupted, his tone steady as stone. It's my father's work, the man you called a liar before he died. The room went silent. Even the ambient hum of the ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. Samuel Otis, Bernard continued, was a senior analyst here for 15 years. He discovered the fraud, reported it internally, was dismissed, discredited, and silenced. 3 weeks after filing his findings with the SEC, his car went off Route 9 into the Mercer River. Brake failure, they said. Mechanical error. Bernard's voice cracked just slightly. Convenient timing. Grange's expression softened with something between sorrow and vindication. Samuel was my colleague, he said, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. We worked together at the Financial Ethics Institute before he joined Myers Global. He was brilliant, incorruptible. When he told me about Project Helios, I believed him. When he died, I knew it wasn't an accident. Chelsea's fingers curled into fists. Dr. Grange, this is slander. This is truth, Dr. Grange interrupted, his tone hardening. The riddle was never a test of intelligence, Ms. Myers. It was a trap, a signal I designed with Samuel 15 years ago as insurance. He embedded the coordinates in his final report, knowing that if he didn't survive, someone would eventually find them. Someone who understood his work. Someone who inherited his integrity. He turned his gaze to Bernard, his eyes glistening. I sent that riddle to see if anyone at Myers Global still embodied the honesty Samuel died defending. I wanted to know if this company had evolved beyond the corruption that built it, or if it was still burying truth to protect power. Bernard met the old man's eyes through the screen. Recognition passed between them. Two survivors of the same war, separated by time but united by purpose. Your father, Dr. Grange said softly, would be proud. Bernard's throat tightened. He nodded once, unable to speak. Chelsea stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble. This is a coordinated attack, a vendetta disguised as due diligence. You've manipulated this entire process. I tested you, Dr. Grange said simply, and you failed. You deleted evidence, fired the one person who could solve the riddle, spent the weekend covering tracks instead of confronting the truth your company was built on. He paused, letting the silence settle. Myers Global doesn't need my investment, Mrs. Myers. It needs an exorcism. The executives exchanged panicked glances. Derek's phone buzzed repeatedly, probably investors demanding explanations. Amanda stared at the ledger as if it were a ticking bomb. Chelsea's empire cracked open before her eyes. The merger? Gone. Her reputation shattered. The carefully constructed narrative of her rise, revealed as fraud built on stolen futures. Bernard stood quiet and still, holding the evidence that would either redeem his father's name or destroy him alongside Chelsea. The janitor who'd been mocked, dismissed, erased, now held the power to unmake a billionaire. Truth, Bernard said softly, answering the riddle one final time. It's born from honesty, feared by those who profit from lies. Hidden in numbers that reveal what's real. He looked at Chelsea, his expression not triumphant, but tired. My father knew that. Dr. Grange knows it, and now so does everyone in this room. The answer had always been simple. The consequences would be anything but. The city skyline bled gold and crimson through floor-to-ceiling windows as Chelsea Meyers stood alone in the office that would soon belong to someone else. Her empire, built over 15 years of calculated ambition, had collapsed in a single morning. The board had demanded her resignation within hours. Investors pulled funding faster than lawyers could draft retention agreements. The merger, $1.2 billion that should have cemented her legacy, evaporated like morning fog burned away by truth. Her phone buzzed with messages she wouldn't answer. Derek Morrison, already distancing himself. Amanda Chen, lawyering up. Richard Miles's widow, threatening legal action to protect her late husband's reputation. Chelsea had spent the afternoon deleting files that no longer mattered, reviewing contracts that had become irrelevant, and confronting the reality that everything she'd built had been constructed on sand. Project Helios, her mentor's fraud, her complicit silence, the convenient death of Samuel Otis, all of it exposed by a janitor carrying his father's truth like a torch through 15 years of darkness. A knock at the door. Chelsea didn't turn. Come in. Bernard Otis entered quietly, still wearing his janitorial uniform, still carrying the quiet dignity that had made him invisible for so long. But he wasn't invisible anymore. Not after this morning. Not after the moment he'd laid truth on a conference table and watched an empire crumble. You wanted to see me, Bernard said. Chelsea finally turned. Her expression was unreadable. Not quite defeated, but no longer arrogant. Something had shifted behind her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or exhaustion from carrying lies that had finally grown too heavy. I did. She moved to her desk and picked up a document. Official letterhead, legal language, signatures awaiting completion. Dr. Grange made his position clear. Myers Global will undergo complete restructuring. New leadership, new ethics oversight, new accountability. Bernard said nothing, just waited. Chelsea signed the document with quick, deliberate strokes. Then she held it out to him. Get this right, she said, her voice carrying the weight of irony she couldn't escape. And you'll never clean again. Bernard took the paper, a reassignment order. Position, ethics compliance consultant. Salary, $127,000 annually. Authority, direct reporting to board of directors. Mandate, ensure transparency across all divisions. He read it slowly, then looked up at Chelsea. No triumph in his expression, no vindication, just calm, unshakable dignity. I wasn't cleaning floors, Miss Myers, Bernard said quietly. I was cleaning history. The words landed between them like a final verdict. Chelsea's jaw tightened, but she nodded once. Acknowledgement, perhaps even respect born from ruin. Your father, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, would be proud. Bernard held her gaze. He already is. Chelsea turned back to the window, dismissing him without words. Bernard left the office that had once represented everything his father had fought against, carrying a document that represented everything his father had died for. Dr. Lionel Grange appeared on the screen once more, addressing the assembled executives and board members. Derek Morrison sat stiffly in his chair. Amanda Chen took notes with trembling hands. The faces that had laughed at Bernard now watched him stand beside the video monitor, EMR, no longer at the room's edge, but at its center. Effective immediately, Dr. Grange announced, Myers Global will implement the Truth Initiative, a comprehensive ethics overhaul designed to prevent the corruption that poisoned this company's foundation. Bernard Otis, son of Samuel Otis, will serve as Chief Ethics Compliance Consultant, overseeing all financial audits, corporate transparency measures, and whistleblower protections. Murmurs rippled through the room. The same executives who'd mocked the janitor now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Otis, Dr. Grange continued, his voice warm, has demonstrated more integrity in 3 days than this company has shown in 15 years. He will report directly to me and the board. His authority is absolute in matters of compliance, and any executive who attempts to undermine his work will answer to me personally. Bernard stood silent, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. From janitor to ethics chief, from invisible to indispensable, from the son of a discredited whistleblower to the guardian of truth his father had died defending. Derek Morrison was the first to stand. He extended his hand across the table, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and pragmatism. Welcome aboard, Bernard. Amanda Chen followed, then in others. One by one, the executives who dismissed him now shook his hand, their grips firm, but their eyes avoiding his. Performance, perhaps, or genuine recognition that the power structure had fundamentally shifted. Bernard accepted each handshake with quiet grace, understanding that respect born from necessity was still a victory. His father hadn't lived to see this moment, but Samuel's work, encrypted in riddles, hidden in numbers, preserved through death, had made it possible. As the meeting adjourned and executives filed out, Bernard remained at the window overlooking the city, the same skyline his father had once admired, the same towers that had seemed unreachable from the basement where he'd mopped floors and dreamed of justice. Your father was right, you know, Dr. Grange said from the screen, still connected. Truth does hide in plain sight. It just takes someone brave enough to see it. Bernard nodded, his throat tight with emotion he'd kept buried for 15 years. Thank you, sir, for not forgetting him. I could never forget Samuel, Dr. Grange said softly, and neither will Myers Global. Not anymore. The screen went dark. Bernard stood alone in the boardroom where he'd once been invisible, now carrying his father's legacy forward into light. The janitor who'd cleaned floors now cleaned consciences, and Chelsea Meyers' promise, delivered in mockery, had become the most honest thing she'd ever said. Bernard Otis stood before the window of his new office on the 32nd floor of Myers Global Holdings, watching the morning sun paint the city in shades of gold. The same skyline he'd once admired while mopping glass now spread before him like a promise kept. His office was modest by executive standards. No marble desk, no leather furniture imported from Italy. Just clean lines, functional space, and a wall dedicated to the Truth Initiative. Photographs of his team, organizational charts showing the new ethics infrastructure, and framed certificates recognizing Myers Global's commitment to transparency. 23 employees now worked under Bernard's leadership. Not Ivy League graduates or MBA holders, but overlooked talent recruited from maintenance, administration, and entry-level positions. People who understood what it meant to be invisible and who now audited the very systems that had dismissed them. Maria Torres, former receptionist, now led financial compliance. James Lau, warehouse supervisor, oversaw supply chain ethics. Keisha Williams, night shift security guard, managed whistleblower protections. His father would have been proud. Samuel had always believed that integrity wasn't taught in boardrooms. It was forged in the lives of people who understood the cost of lies. Bernard checked his watch. 10:15 a.m. He had time before the quarterly board meeting, where he'd present the initiative's 6-month report, 12 policy reforms implemented, 4 executive investigations completed, 0 tolerance established for retaliation. He grabbed his jacket and the bouquet of white lilies waiting on his desk, his mother's favorites, and headed for the elevator. Grace Otis sat in the sunlit common room, her wheelchair positioned near the garden windows where spring flowers bloomed in riotous color. Age and illness had diminished her body, but her eyes, sharp, knowing, proud, held the same strength that Bernard remembered from childhood. "There's my son," she said softly as Bernard approached, her smile lighting her face. "The one who changed everything." Bernard knelt beside her wheelchair, presenting the lilies. "For you, Mama." She accepted them with trembling hands, inhaling their fragrance. Then she noticed the newspaper clipping he'd tucked into the bouquet, carefully laminated, preserved like the treasure it was. "Janitor exposes corporate fraud, promoted to lead ethics division." The headline right there across the front page of the Financial Times, accompanied by a photograph of Bernard standing in the Myers Global boardroom beside Dr. Lionel Grange. The article detailed Project Helios, Samuel Otis's 15-year-old investigation, and the son who'd completed his father's work. Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Your father is watching, Bernard. I feel him every day. He's so proud of you." Bernard's throat tightened. "I'm just finishing what he started." "No." She gripped his hand with surprising strength. "You're proving what he always believed, that one person with truth is stronger than an empire built on lies. You did that, son, not him. You." Bernard stayed for an hour, reading to her from the articles that had followed. Dr. Grange's op-ed praising whistleblower protections, the SEC's expanded investigation into offshore fraud, Chelsea Meyers' resignation and ongoing legal battles. When he finally left, his mother was asleep in her wheelchair, the newspaper clipping clutched to her chest like a love letter from the past. Evening settled over the city as Bernard locked his office door, preparing to head home. But he paused before leaving, drawn to the wall opposite his desk where a single frame hung, carefully positioned to catch the afternoon light. The riddle, printed on aged paper, mounted behind glass, preserved exactly as it had appeared that first night in the boardroom. "I am born of truth, but feared by power. I hide in numbers, yet reveal what's real. What am I?" Beneath it, Bernard had added a line in his father's handwriting, copied from Samuel's journal with painstaking care. Each letter a tribute to the man who'd taught him that some questions mattered more than their answers. Truth, the only riddle that solves us all. Bernard stood before it, reflecting on the journey from invisible janitor to ethics chief. He'd gained an office, a salary that paid his mother's care and his own bills. He'd earned respect from executives who'd once mocked him. He'd built a department that would protect future whistleblowers from the fate his father had suffered. But he'd also lost something, the anonymity, the quiet nights mopping floors while the powerful made decisions above him, the simplicity of knowing exactly where he stood in the world. Power came with complexity. Visibility came with scrutiny. And justice, Bernard had learned, was never as clean as the marble floors he'd once polished. Still, standing in his office, overlooking the city his father had loved, Bernard felt something his father had died without experiencing. Peace. Not because the fight was over, corruption never truly died. It just moved to new addresses. But because Samuel Otis's name had been cleared, his work had been validated. His son had ensured that the truth buried 15 years ago had finally risen to light. Bernard turned off the lights and locked his office. Tomorrow, he'd return to audit reports, compliance meetings, and the endless work of keeping powerful people honest. But tonight, he'd go home to his modest apartment, upgraded now, but still humble, and read from his father's journals. He'd trace the riddles Samuel had written, decode the ciphers only a son could understand, and remember that truth wasn't just an answer. It was a legacy, a responsibility, and a riddle that would never stop solving those brave enough to ask it. As Bernard walked through the quiet building, passing offices where tomorrow's decisions would be made, he whispered the words that had become his mantra, his father's gift, and his life's purpose. Truth, the only riddle that solves us all. And somewhere in the space between memory and eternity, Samuel Otis smiled. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.